All righty. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for your patience. And we are so excited that you are here joining us today for this webinar. If you have been following along, we have had a diversity, equity, and inclusion in education and mental health webinar series going on for this whole school year. So we've had a few other presentations that have all been awesome. And Alyson will be wrapping us up, wrapping up our webinar series for this year. So we are so excited that she will be here presenting for us. So just a few reminders, we will go for about 45-50 minutes for our presentation, then do a Q&A, but feel free to throw questions in the chat as we go. We will be recording this, so mute your sound, but feel free to turn on your video if you feel comfortable. And we do have an ASL interpreter here with us, so she should be pinned on your screen, or if not, feel free to pin her video so that you can see that and you have access to that. So with that, let's jump into introducing Alyson. Alyson is a doctoral student in the educational psychology program at the University of Utah. So prior to pursuing her PhD, Alyson spent the past decade working as a licensed school counselor and outpatient mental health therapist as she earned her MS.Ed in school counseling and obtained an advanced graduate certificate in mental health counseling. Alyson has worked in a myriad of educational settings, traditional brick and mortar, online and blended learning models with both middle school and high school students. As a therapist, Alyson engaged with forensic and general mental health clients. Alyson's researching interests are inspired by the interactions with her students and focus on sexual and gender minority youth, mental health, and school-based interventions. So we will turn the time over to Alyson for her presentation on escaping stigma, strategies to support sexual and gender minority youth in education.
Hey everyone, I'm really excited to be here with you, and I'm just going to get set up real quick and just sharing this presentation with you. Make sure I get that. Make sure I share the right one. Maybe I shared the wrong. Okay, here we go. Okay, here we go. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here and the introduction. And so for me, I recognize that this is a Friday afternoon. There's a million places that you could be, and you chose to be here. And so I am truly grateful for that. And I am also excited for the opportunity to have a chance to learn and engage and interact with everyone. And so the introduction gave you a little bit of an idea of who I am, but at the same time, this slide, why I think it's important is just thinking about and talking about the context and the history and the lens of where I'm speaking from and why I feel so passionately about this topic. And so, yes, I'm Alyson, I'm a doctoral student, I'm a female. There's some different things on here that describe me as descriptors. Starting out in education, I had these two really awesome educators that were tremendous mentors as I was going through school. And essentially it felt just like a pay it forward. Yeah, natural progression. This is what I want to do. As I started working in New York City public schools, and then working out in the suburbs of New York City, transitioning to work into dropout recovery, one thing that I continually started to see with my students was challenges with mental health. And so going back to school and pursuing my mental health degree, my educational aspirations have really just been in line with my students' needs. And so as we flash forward to this point where I am right now in this program, it was kind of threefold for me. And so the first thing being, hey, I work with a lot of children with special needs, wanting to ensure that I knew how to best serve them and their different needs. The second one being, hey, this is a crazy climate that we're in right now. With the pandemic, the different things, regardless of what was happening, our students are still being required to achieve. And so what are the different ways that we can help them? And then the third one are my sexual and gender minority youth. And so for me, in talking about some of these descriptors that I've put up here to describe myself, one thing that I left out is identifying as a lesbian. And so for me, that label, and growing up in a predominantly religious culture, working in Utah, seeing some of the stigma and some of the challenges that my students were going through, recognizing some of the limitations that I had as a school counselor, and that really being a catalyst in what it is and what I wanted to do. And so for me, that is one thing I wanted to talk about today. And so this is one of my cute students who's a big catalyst in what and why I do what I do. And that's what I want to talk about. No, not my experience, but my cute students, your cute students, the individuals that we interact with, that we're engaging with, to get a better understanding and idea of what it is that they're going through and the different ways that we can meet their needs. And so just in starting, talking about terms, because I said sexual and gender minority youth, and some of you may be, yes, I totally know, and some of you may be like, come again, what is that? And so just to give us some kind of a baseline and to also go through the numbers, and especially if you are I almost said a nerd. I don't mean that really. I just mean a numbers person. And so you really enjoy looking at data. I haven't always been one of those people, but I've really grown to love it. And I'll talk more about that and just the current landscape as it is in Utah and as it is around our nation and some of the different things that are happening for our students. And then most importantly, talking about different strategies and ways that we can support and help our students. Okay, so sexual and gender minority youth, what are you talking about? And so this may be a familiar term. For starters, I thought this was a really cute way. And so what this is we'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit, but my students, I have this group that I run with them, and it is an identity group, and it's a middle school. And so the activity that we were talking about for this day, we were talking about different ways that people can look at us from the outside and they make different perceptions about us based on how we look, our skin color, what's happening. And sometimes what those outside perspectives say, they kind of go through that stigma. And sometimes we start to internalize and sometimes we start to believe them. And so one of the things that I asked my students to do was to identify themselves. How did they see themselves? And so for this student, I thought they summed it up so beautifully in just saying, we're all human, we're all the same. Every person should be happy. It doesn't matter how we look, it doesn't matter if we're different, we're all humans. And I was like, what a sweet little gentle reminder. And then also just the way that they chose to identify themselves and saying that, yeah, I'm proud, I'm smart, I'm binary, I'm non-binary, and I'm funny. So irregardless of some of that outside noise, just the ways that they were able to still maintain some truth to themselves. And so these are the definitions and what I'm referring to when I talk about sexual and gender minority. And I'm very much a visual person. And so when people say umbrella terms, literally, yes, an umbrella. Here's the umbrella. When I talk about gender minorities, all the terms that fall underneath it. So when I talk about gender minority, the gender identity, do they identify more as a man or a woman? Or, you know, what does that expression look like on the outside? Is it more masculine or is it more feminine? And what are some of those biological components? And so when we talk about gender in the context that I will today, this is the reference that I'm talking about. And when we talk about sexual minorities, some of the terms that you may have more commonly heard is the LGBTQIA. And so we talk about like sexual orientation and romantic attraction. And that's where the lesbian and the L comes from, and the B for bisexual. And so being a visual person, I love this chart. And there are a couple of different charts you may be familiar with. There is the gender unicorn, but for me, I really like the genderbread man, partially because I'm a huge foodie, but also I just love the way that it was so descriptive for me. And so we talked about some of these terms already, but in my growing up, and I'd like to think that I'm not that old, and in some ways maybe I'm getting there, but it just also goes to show how things are progressing and how they've progressed over time and just some of the things that are changing. And so when we think about gender, you know, here's this expression, this is what people see on the outside of us, and here's this identity, and this is how I feel on the inside. And I'll go more into and talk about these specifically. And then we talk about this attraction piece, and this is how I feel in my heart. And here's some of these anatomical pieces. And so for so long, I think people, and I'll just say me, have had a notion that it's like, yeah, it's either this or it's that. And in all reality, it's not. There's so many different things that are going to make this up for us. Okay. And so before we go into this a little bit any further, I want to do an attitude check. And no, I don't mean an attitude check like, oh, you're rude. I just mean an attitude check in the context of, as we start to work with this population, I think about some of the things, and even in my own identity and the ways that I was raised. I'm Hawaiian Chinese, I'm a female, I'm a minority, I'm a student, I'm an educator. All of these different things that we bring to the table are going to impact our work with our students. And so I've thought about different ways. If we were in person with each other, I'd probably be running around the room and, asking for participation and stuff. And please always feel free to interject too. I come from one of those really large, intrusive Polynesian families. And so please feel free to add. But I just wanted to take pause right now and have you do your own evaluation. What are some of the things that you bring to the table? Because when we start to reflect on these things, some of these things that we carry may potentially be harmful. And when we talk about and when we work with this marginalized population, and sometimes in some of the things that we bring, we're not even necessarily aware. Sometimes we're not always aware of those things. And so as I started to go through this and I saw this power privilege checklist, I was like, oh, that's really cool. And so this was just one of the things that I wanted to include as just kind of like a check for ourselves. And I think even, for me, I try and be super self-aware, and I'm not always as good as I should or could be. And so I try and push myself in different ways. And I thought this could just be like a cool thing if you wanted to do a little bit of a check-in. Okay. So in going forward and talking about our genderbread man again, and just thinking about how we bring and some of those different things, how we've traditionally or how we were raised into thinking about gender, thinking about sexuality, and using this to explain what a lot of our students and how and what it is that they're going through. Okay, so another thing that I want to talk about is things being on a continuum. And I could probably talk to you all day about a lot of different things in relation to this. I could talk about the Kinsey scale and where we lie on that. And I think sometimes it's either this or that. It's black and white. You're gay or you're not. You like the same gender, you don't, and it's not. So when we talk about that gender identity and how we feel inside, it doesn't necessarily have to be all woman. It doesn't have to necessarily have to be all man. That expression on the outside, it's not all feminine or masculine. And so that's why I appreciate this right here. And just some of these different things under here, when we talk about gender identity, these are some of the different things that we're referring to. And I'll give you the definitions in just a second, I promise. But for me, sometimes when I learn about new things or I am engaging with a topic, to be able to see it visually and then to have that formalized definition just helps it stick. And so I'm hoping this will help these things make a little bit more sense as well. And so when we talk about identity, expression, sex, gender, sexual orientation, there was a Khan Academy video, and I totally nerd out and love those. And so when I started to watch it, it was like, here's your identity. Okay, Alyson, you're a female. Okay, you were born a female, that's how you identify. Okay, your expression on the outside. Okay, you're female. Your sex gender, female, that's how you identify. Now, typically the orientation, because I am female, would be that I would be attracted to men. I would be heterosexual. And so it would just be this binary line. It's either this or it's that. And that's what this is saying right here. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if your identity on the outside says, hey, I may present as a female. On the inside, I may feel more masculine. I may be attracted to men. And so I appreciate this just giving us that visual. So I don't want to spend too much time on the terms, but I definitely want to provide some context in giving you these as well. So the expression on the outside, that's what people see. This identity piece, this is how we're going to feel how we're conforming. If it's man, if it's woman, this is how we're identifying. This gender assignment and this sex, those are going to be some of those biological components, and those are the physical trait, the physical, the anatomical, the gonads, the genitalia. And so this is kind of what I was just talking about in that continuum with that line. So in being born a female, having the anatomical component makeup of a woman, I identify as a cisgendered woman. That's how I was born. That's how I identify. If I were to say, hey, this is the anatomical body that I was born into, but I don't necessarily feel like it's congruent with who I am, Transgender, that would be where I would be moving into a different, hey, maybe I feel more masculine, maybe I want to make that transition. And genderqueer is just saying, hey, I don't identify with either one of these. I kind of have some different parts of each of them. And so I want to make the point too, in just saying that with these terms, and even this one, it's not inclusive of everything that there is. And I'll explain that more in just one second. This last one is attraction. And so on the continuum, am I sexually attracted to a female? Am I sexually attracted to a male? Am I romantically or physically, what is my attraction? And so I want to read this quote real quick, because I was like, what does this mean? And so it just says a sexual versus romantic attraction. They're different. And sexual attraction comes from a sexual desire for something or someone, while romantic attraction is what we want to have in a romantic relationship with someone, which may sound super straightforward, but I know the first time that I read this, I was like, what's the difference? So that romantic component, and not necessarily saying that, it's going to be physical, but just having that romantic attraction. We talked a little bit about orientation before, sexual orientation, and a lesbian being predominantly attracted to another woman, a gay person being attracted to someone of the same sex, someone who is bisexual is, open to either gender, and someone who is questioning it isn't sure. And so when I said before that these terms aren't inclusive of everything, my sweet students will be the first to tell you, Alyson, you're missing Z. And I was like, what is Z? They're like, I could be a pansexual, demi-romantic, and I'm probably messing some of those up, but this isn't inclusive of everything. But just for the perfect purpose of this conversation today, these are the ones that I'm referring to. Okay, so we talk about numbers, and people have always been like, numbers, data. If you work in education, is this data? Does it support your intervention? And I was like, man, this is a lot. As I've started to do this, I really appreciate the numbers. And in this context, I'm reluctant to say that I'm excited about the data, but in one way, I think it just really underscores a need that our students are expressing. And so that's what I want to talk about in this way. And what we're looking at we're going to look at some national data, but I also want to make sure that if you are in Utah, or if you're outside of Utah, that you're able to find some data sets that kind of paint a picture for where it is that you are. And so for starters, I want to talk just about the Trevor Project. And the Trevor Project is a national organization. And so I pulled some of their numbers out, and the numbers that I pulled out, they're kind of alarming, but I want to make a comparison to what's happening for our students. So this is a national sample, and it says, hey, 42% of our students in the last year considered suicide. What? Okay, 72% of our LGBTQ students are reporting symptoms of anxiety. When we talk about our transgender or our non-binary youth, then it goes to 3 and 4. We talk about major depressive disorder or depressive symptoms within the past 2 weeks, 62%. And then we talk about those transgender and non-binary, we're 2 out of 3. And so when I talk about, that's a national data set that you can look at. When we talk about data that's in your own backyard, and I apologize if this is redundant for any of you, but when I first learned about this, I totally nerded out on it, because this data set right here, and what this is, if you navigate to the Utah Department of Human Services, or even if you just Google Sharp Survey Utah, it'll take you to this homepage. And what this is these are different reports. And so I live in Davis County. And so if I were curious, I could click on Davis County and it would aggregate all of the data for Davis County schools. For the purpose of our conversation today, we're going to use the gay or lesbian students. And so I just want to make sure that the data sets can shrink down a little bit more if you're curious about what's happening in your county. And chances are, I know from my schools, they also have school specific reports too. And so there are different people you can ask about that as well. Okay, so we looked at some of those national numbers when we look in our own backyard for Utah. And this is only inclusive of gay or lesbian. But when we talk about it still, it's going to show us some of those same disproportionate rates. And so when we look at depressive symptoms for our lesbian and gay students in Utah, 34% demonstrated high depressive symptoms. So the students could identify with low, moderate, or high. And so 34 versus 10% of their cisgendered or heterosexual peers. 47%, and this one I was like, what the heck? Purposeful acts of self-harm. So cutting, burning, at least one time in the last 12 months versus 17%. 48.3% is seriously considered suicide in the past 12 months. And this one down here at the bottom, I was like, oh boy. And this is why I think when we talk about like statistics, these are the ways that I started to be like, oh dang, okay, this is how we're really calling attention. 42.4% of students who felt sad or hopeless or suicidal didn't say anything to anyone. And so these are potentially the students that we're interacting with and we're seeing on a daily basis. Okay, so I'm hoping that you'll humor me for just a second. I wanted to add some of these like fact or fiction or stop and checks so I don't put you to sleep, but also just because some of these things, as I was reading through them, I was like, what? And so fact or fiction for just a second. So we're still talking about Utah data. And so I apologize if I'm reading this for just a second. I want to make sure that I get everything correctly. Okay, so our first one is the vast majority of LGBTQ students in Utah regularly heard anti-LGBTQ remarks. And so think for just a second. And yeah, it's true. That's a fact. And I think what was most alarming for me in just learning that was that 22% of students heard staff making homophobic remarks, and 45% of students heard staff also making homophobic remarks or remarks about students' external appearance. And I was like, what? No wonder why when we talk about some of these challenges that our students are facing in school, and some of them, you know, not feeling comfortable, that they're having these challenges. Okay, next one. Most LGBTQ students in Utah experience anti-LGBTQ victimization at school. Okay, you probably guessed it, but that one's also true. And so they weren't only just victimized based on their sexual orientation, they were also victimized based on religion, 39%, disability, 35%. And that's where, if I can get it, maybe not. Maybe I skipped one. Okay, well, it was a snapshot. It was the Gleason snapshot of Utah. And I'm afraid to touch anything because it may go backwards and I'll never get it back. But the slide was talking about the Gleason snapshot. And what it is it was talking about the experience of students in Utah and their experience at school. And it's pretty powerful, I think, we think or may speculate, yeah, these things are happening in my own backyard. What does it really mean? Okay, but to see the numbers, it's like, oh, dang, okay, you really can't ignore this. And so when we talk about stigma with our students, and we talk about some of the things that they're contending with, some of that discrimination, some of that prejudice, well, how do we explain some of those disparities? Because when we looked at our cisgendered students, even just in that first category with major depressive, and then we looked at our population of our sexual and gender minority youth, it was disproportionate. So a way that we can explain it is through the minority stress model. It's a framework that helps us. And so it totally makes sense in the context like, hey, these students are going through stigma, they're going through prejudice, they're going through discrimination. Hey, they're having to hide their sexuality, they're having to go through all of these experiences and internalizing their homophobia. Well, no wonder there's going to be a disproportionality between our cisgendered and our sexual and gender minority students. And so this is a flow chart. It's a little bit of a chart in the way that they tried to explain it. And so, hey, we have these circumstances, you have this minority status. And when I talked about my different identifiers, and I'm not going to talk about intersectionality, but intersectionality, when we look at this and we're like, okay, sexual orientation. Oh, okay, then we have this minority identity. Oh, dang, okay, then over here we have this prejudice and this discrimination. And so, yeah, this is why, or this is how we can start to understand why some of those mental health disparities are happening between the two populations. Okay. So one of the reasons that this whole topic came up is because of the educational climate in Utah. And so in September, our superintendent of schools came out with a directive and said, hey, so I appreciate that y'all, that your teachers have been wanting to get to know your students. However, there have been some things that they have been asking and some things that have surfaced that are not congruent with law. And so I have this fantastic mentor, educator, administrator, Stacy, and I tried to bribe her to come here with me today, but she thought going to Denver would be more fun. And so I asked her, she sits on the Utah State Board of Ed, and I asked her some different questions about this. So as I start this, I fully acknowledge that I am not a law student, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm gonna try to explain it and just give you kind of like the bare bones example of it and why it is impacting our educators. Okay, so our superintendent of schools referenced the Utah rights, the parents' rights. And so what it says is like, hey, when you go in and you ask about a pronoun, like, is the parent okay with it? And so what she's essentially saying right here is like, hey, we have to consider the parents' rights when we're doing that. Okay. So what the USBE did is they came out with this gender identity guidance. And what they're hoping is that it'll give us some directive and some help in navigating some of these really potentially challenging situations. And so they have this gender identity guidance that has already come out. They were going to have a meeting on February 23rd, but the crazy thing, they've already had 20,000 public comments on it. And so this is now going to be on March 11th. But what does this entail? And when I say help with certain things, what does that mean? And so these are some of the challenging things that we have seen come, and I'm sure you've seen or have been in the news or you've heard about, even if it's just in talking about athletics and, oh my gosh, this student got to do this and they were on the swim team. And I'm sure in one way or another, you've heard about some of these different things. And so while this isn't law right now, they're just going through this and they're trying to establish some guidelines for us. And so I just want to make reference to this and how this is super practical in what it is that we're doing. Okay. And so as I was asking Stacy, I was like, okay, so what do they use? Like, how do we know? And so these are the references that the USBE used in making their decisions, some of their references. But also what they did is they went through and they looked at different state policies and they went through different court cases. So I mention this because this is just an example of Hawaii. And it's like, hey, so they looked at Hawaii's policy on gender identity. Okay, and this is what Hawaii does. Okay. And so what essentially has happened is that they've taken different state policies, they've taken different laws, different court cases. And so that's what they've used as a reference, as a guide for doing all of these things. And I was like, okay, so what about federal law? Like, doesn't that supersede? Because our students have rights under Title IX, where we can't discriminate on the basis of sex. And what about the 14th Amendment? And I feel tremendously lucky that I have all of these people in my life. This amazing history teacher. I was like, Lisa, can you clarify this for me? Can you explain this just in a little bit more? And so just trying to look at these different laws and asking Stacy and being like, hey, so doesn't this supersede what's happening in Utah? And even just being in NASP last week and listening to some different presentations and having people being like, yeah, just go out, just ask pronouns, just do this, and I'm like, man, that's a little bit different. That feels different than what's happening for us. And so what she said is, yeah, it's not necessarily law, but we've used all of these different things as evidence to say, hey, this is why we're recommending this. If you would like to avoid lawsuit, and I hope I'm paying her justice and saying and articulating everything and explaining it. But this is as I understood it. And so I bring that up because as we start to go into these different situations with our student, irregardless of being able to ask a pronoun or not ask a pronoun, I think there's a lot of things that we can still do to make them feel super inclusive and safe in ways that we can foster a really great environment for them. And so I mentioned all of that law stuff because I also acknowledge being in Davis County is super different than what happens when I'm in Salt Lake School District. And I recognize, well, I'll talk about it in just a second. So as we, whoa. Okay, now it's going crazy. When we talk about the first thing and just what can we do is to educate yourself. And so this goes back to one of my sweet students again, and I have them write like different reflections about how they're doing, because I also acknowledge that sometimes they're not going to tell me, and sometimes they're a little bit more afraid to speak up in a group. And so this is one of those things, and I bring this up in educating yourself because sometimes we're not always aware of what our students are going through. Yeah, sometimes we do. But this is just an example of you and you being here and engaging in different opportunities to learn and to just become more abreast and more aware. And so for this on my student, just no one respects my pronouns. A lot of people are mean to me. Most people don't like me. And so this is just like an instance of like, oh my gosh, okay, this is what one of my students is going through. Like, what are some things that I can do? And so I talked about stats a little bit in the beginning, and as we go through some of these different strategies, I want to put these in here too, just as kind of like a reference point and saying, yeah, this is why we're looking at this. This is why this is really important. So just in looking at this part of our students that feel safe in schools. So 69.7% of our gay and lesbian students versus 89% of our cisgendered and heterosexual students feel safe at school. And so when we talk about some of these different things that can be done, and I acknowledge that some of you may not be in like a position of leadership, or you may be in mental health, or you may be a student, or you may, and so I mentioned this as I was going through this presentation too, and kind of thinking about different things that I wanted to talk about. One of the things that I did was poll my students, and I was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. What do you guys think? Like, what should I talk about? And one of the students, what they said is they were like, well, if people want to help, like they should just write their politician. And so I appreciate that. And I acknowledge that not all these strategies are going to be, directly related to what it is that you're doing. But I think we can talk about it in the context of best practices. And we can talk about it and kind of take some of these pieces. And so even if this is school policy practice and implication, when we talk about fostering warm school environments and climates, we can take that to our classrooms. And so I'll give you, or our offices, and I'll give you an example of my school in Salt Lake. And I recognize this may not be the norm everywhere. But one of the cool things that they do is it's a pretty diverse population. And so they take flags from every country that the student is from, and they hang them in the hall. They also have like trans flags, or they have different flags that are supporting different individuals. And so it's not just focused on those SGM youth, but it's focused on just that inclusive environment for everyone. And so I was like, man, that's pretty cool. Some of the other things too, and just talking to my students, there is like a library case. And so like, say for instance, in February, there were authors that were featured for Black History Month. And my students are like, hey, what about having different authors being featured for, like SGM or LGBTQ authors? Like, what if some of those got integrated in there? Okay, that's pretty cool. What about, and I have this awesome mentor supervisor as he's kind of mentored me in these different discussions with my students. What about having a culture fair? And so I talk about this in an inclusive way, because if you are a part of one of those schools that's like, hey, we can't fully, just go straight to our SGM and supporting them, then hey, why don't we make it an inclusive cultural environment? Let's have a culture fair. Let's have students from all walks of life. Okay, you're Polynesian, cool. What does that look like? Can we have a station where you bring some kind of food, or you have music or something? Okay, yeah, our trans students, if you guys want to show up, you want to have flags or talk about some of the history, cool. And so these were just some of the different types of ideas that they mentioned, and that I've kind of learned and just heard about. Safeguarding our sexual gender minority youth identity. And I just mentioned that some of our students may not be ready to come out. They may have disclosed to us that they're ready. You may know their pronouns. You may know some of the things that they're contending with, but they just may not be ready for it yet. And so just making sure that you have those conversations with them and just saying, okay, yeah, no problem. And then also just professional development opportunities. One of the things that my school in Davis County did that I really appreciated was just we had one professional development a month that was devoted to some kind of different PD. And so we've had individuals come in from mental health organizations to talk about healthy relationships. We've had, like homeless outreach organizations come in. We've had people from the Utah Pride Center come out. And so I appreciate these because, yes, I do think it's super important to talk about and be abreast and aware of some of the things with our SGM youth, but I think there's also a lot of things too. And so by just kind of like normalizing that, yeah, let's talk about trauma. Let's talk about some of these different things and just looking at different opportunities. Okay, so our students, are they worried about being bullied at school? So 45.6% of our gay and lesbian students, yeah, they are worried about being bullied. And so as I mentioned with my student, like, hey, what do you want? What should I talk about? I also asked some of my teachers, hey, what should I talk about? And so just one of my teachers, super tenured, well, I say super tenured, she's probably like 10 years in the field. And so one of the things that she had said, she's like, Alyson, I don't know what to do when there's tension between the students in the classroom. Like, how do I do that? And so one of the things, being an ally, and we'll talk about like strategies in just a second, as we talk about, how to like shut down some of those conversations. But one of the things that my students have consistently said is, I asked like, hey, what's so-and-so, just in like general conversation, what's your favorite teacher? Oh, it's Mr. So-and-so. Why is that? Well, sometimes the kids could be like really rude or stupid or say things, and he'll always shut them down. Okay. Oh, I really like going to this teacher because it's like, they don't really, they don't make me feel weird about things. I can just kind of be myself. It's not awkward. And so like, these are the little things when we talk about being an ally, when we talk about creating a safe space, and we'll talk about language and some of the different things. But when we talk about, as a school environment, how to make things look a little bit more safe, we can take those things into our classroom. We can take them into our office. We can do little things to show students that, yeah, we're a safe space. You can come here. It's okay. One of the things also that they mentioned is like, hey, can you not group me by gender? Can you choose something else to group us by? So if you're doing like a group activity and it's like, here's girls, here's boys, or can you do something different? And so I thought that was curious. And I definitely recognize like in different situations, especially like with PE or something, it may not be as straightforward, but just choosing different ways to group the students. I was like, oh, okay, this seemed like a pretty easy strategy. And just being kind. That's what one of my students said too. And just what I've read is just, hey, be kind. Like how crazy and how crazy simple is that? Just being kind. Okay, so when we talk about like bullying and harassment, and one of those challenges that my teacher just said, like, hey, what do I do when there is contention? It's going to happen. It's going to rise. And so this is the sweet little map of the U.S. and these are the states. These blue states are ones that have these bullying, anti-bullying laws. For us, as these things start to happen, it's like, hey, call it out, like that teacher did. And it doesn't have to be like one of those punitive, like punishing type things. It could just be like, hey, like we're different. That's cool. If the world would be super boring if we were all the same. But what we want to make sure, and what we want to foster and encourage is a respectful, inclusive environment. And so just saying, hey, those names, that name calling, that action, what it is, it's not appropriate. And so we can use it as a moment to be like, hey, those teachable moments, and to talk about those things with our students. We can hold our students accountable. And when we talk about some of these different policies and procedures, that falls under holding the students accountable, because what do those policies look like for our students? Are our SGM students protected under them? What does that look like for them? GSAs have been wildly are shown to be really good for our students. And so when we look at these GSAs, they reduce levels of victimization. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a GSA either. And so I know there's a little bit of like this middle school blind spot. And so for my students, that's where I work, is at a middle school. And so one of the things that we talk about is identity, but it's not specifically about the sexual or gender minority, that identity, LGBTQ, it's inclusive of everything. And so I just mention that because if your school is like, hey, you know, I don't feel good about this, I don't support this, there's just different ways that we can talk about this. But gay straight alliances have been proven to be wildly effective in helping our LGBTQIA students. Okay, inclusive curriculum. One of my students is like, hey, I don't see myself anywhere in these stories. And so I recognize that some of this is like, may have to go through principals, or may have to go through different approvals or processes. And so it's just taking these opportunities when we have the chance to promote diversity, that we're able to do that our students are able to see themselves. And I know for me growing up, I didn't have those role models. I didn't see myself in anyone. And so just knowing, hey, okay, I'm cool. I'm okay how I am and with who I am. Social emotional learning opportunities. And so whether you are looking at a curriculum like from Gleason or from the Trevor Project or from wherever, there are these different opportunities that we can use to teach our students about empathy, about diversity, about inclusion. And this is just another way. And I realize I'm running out of time, and so I'm talking a little bit faster, and so I apologize. But just wanted to acknowledge that that's why I'm talking a little bit faster. But SEL is super important, and just something that we can integrate into the classroom and talking about different skills. Okay, 68.5% of our gay and lesbian students felt sad or hopeless 2 or more weeks in a row in the past year. What? Okay, so for me, I look at that and I'm like, holy cow, that's quite a few students. And so when I talked about my group and what we do in identity, these are some different like therapeutic topics that you could talk about with students if you're in that capacity, if you're in that mental health capacity. We could also, if you're not, make those referrals. Is there a school psychologist? Is there a social worker? Is there an outside agency or a partner that we can refer them to? And so if you're able to have some of those conversations in there, yeah, we can talk about self-esteem. We can talk about some of those things. We can talk about relationships and what healthy relationships look like. We can talk about depression. So some of these things we can talk about and support the student without specifically being like, oh, you're gay, let's talk about that. So that's why I mentioned this too, is just like in the middle school, we talk about identity, and we try and be inclusive of everything. So yeah, it could be skin color. Yeah, it could be sexuality. Yeah, it could be gender. And so just thinking about the ways that we can be inclusive, you know, and still being mindful of some of the directives that we have here. Okay, and talking about inclusivity, that was another thing that came up from one of my teachers, is like, I don't know how to do it. So I don't know. And my cute, sweet dad, he's in his 70s, and he's like, Al, I was at the store and I saw this person, and, you know, they looked like a female. And so I was like, ma'am, and they were like, excuse me, that's not. And so acknowledging that sometimes we want to do good and we mean well, but we don't always know how. And so I think that's the perfect example of what my teacher said. I don't know how to go about this. And so the Merriam-Webster, like, this was their definition of a pronoun. But one of my students is just like, hey, a pronoun is what people like to go by, and it's a grammar thing. And I was like, how cute and simple is that? And so when we talk about language, language is such an easy thing to do. And I know I've like preached to you about like, hey, this is what's happening in the Utah climate, and here I'm telling you to ask. In a perfect world, that's the easiest. Can I ask your name? Whom may I say is here? And I learned about some of these simple strategies just in NAS. And I was like, man, that's easy. So when you have a parent that's waiting in the office, whom may I say is here? Just being inclusive of some of those different terminologies in introductions, using your own pronouns. So a student is like, oh, okay, yeah, it's okay, you're safe. I'm safe. I'm safe to be who I am. And just some of those other, I have one of my professors always says, hey, y'all. And so that's how he makes the introduction to our class. And one of the examples in a school is the gentleman used was, good morning, scholars. And so there's just different ways that we can be inclusive in our language and just accepting without 100% being like, what are you? What would you like to go by? To kind of alleviate some of those challenges. Okay, what if you make a mistake? Yes, it's likely going to happen. I have done it completely unintentionally, but I wanted to bring this slide up too, is because as I was going through some things, I really appreciated this pronoun guide, because as I was looking at it and in my head, I'm like, well, if I'm approaching one student, do I say youth? In New York, everyone would say youth. So, okay, I can do that. But just being able to practice too, how are you feeling today? They left their homework. Some of these different ways just to become more familiarized. But as I was going through this is the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. This is their resource center for their LGBTQIA students. And as I was fishing through, there's this little thing down here, and it was a video game. And so and when I clicked on it, this is what popped up. And then it produced this, and it was like, hey, do you want to see different examples? So I mentioned Z earlier, as my students were like, yo, Z is one too. And I'm like, Z, what are you Z, what? And so these are some just different examples, and they've integrated it into a video game. And so when we talk about ways to get more familiarized with different pronouns and even some of these different usages like he, her, they, what? And so just familiarizing ourselves so we can be more inclusive with our students. Okay, family matters, and family matters very greatly and importantly. And so different collaborative practices. One of my teachers, what happens if I know there's conflict at home? What happens if I know that the parent isn't okay with the student going by their preferred pronoun? And I think it's very real to be, hey, I see you. This sucks. It's hard. I dig, I understand, and I'm here for you. And I hope that you know that if I can't refer to you in this way, it doesn't mean that I don't respect your pronouns or I don't respect you. This is kind of the environment and where I'm at, but I want you to know I'm here for you. And I know for some of my teachers, as they've come in and they've been like, well, what do I do? And I'm like, hey, it's okay. Like, refer to a school counselor. So the school counselor can have that conversation. So does that mean the school counselor can talk to them and, maybe talk about, hey, what does this look like? Would your parents be okay with it? What are some challenges that you're feeling around that and around disclosure? And in a school counseling capacity, I recognize you're limited too. So you may not have the time or the ability to say, hey, okay, yeah, let's sit down and do this. You may want to make a community-based referral as well. Or maybe there's a school-based option for them, and family therapy too. And so parents, how do we help them too? Because I think my mind always goes to like, oh, unsupportive parents, but yeah, there are supportive parents. One of the amazing school counselors I work with, she's always like, how can I help, like as a parent to an SGM student, like what is it that I can do? And so yeah, fostering an affirming home environment, encouraging the parents to speak, to talk to their students about different things. And I want to make sure that I bring this up to Dr. Caitlin Ryan out of San Francisco. It's going to be in just a second, but this is the Family Acceptance Project, and I had an opportunity to hear her speak a couple years ago. And these are just some different things as you are talking to families. These are some different things. And one thing I really appreciated about this is when she spoke is like, she was like, hey, so they have guidebooks, and this is specifically catered to LDS families. And no, it's not just this one. She has there's a whole bunch of them, but I thought this one was just really interesting considering the climate that we work in. And I'm not going to play this video, but if you have a chance to go to their website, what it is they have different videos about, and this is a student story. And what it is they have like different stories for students. Kind of cool just to talk about. And the idea or the premise, or some of these parents are really unsupportive initially. And so they kind of work with them, and it tells their story. So I want to make sure and bring that up too. And yes, it's Dr. Caitlin Ryan, and it is San Francisco State University. And there's a wealth of resources for families in there too, and how to help and encourage. I want to mention this one real quick, is just as I was talking to my teachers, and saying like, hey, what are your different experiences? This one kind of caught me off guard. And because I absolutely 100% love the individual that said it, and also 150% acknowledge that, yes, this is some of the outlook and some of the thoughts and feelings for the teachers and the individuals that we may encounter as colleagues. And so what he said is, he's like, hey, you know, I think that being transgender is a mental illness. I think this is a cry for help. I think that it's a fad. I think it's more popular now. I've only dealt with this once in the past 20 years. And, you know, people are gonna say, hey, you have to use this and you have to refer to people in this different way. And he's like, I really don't want to be forced to do that. And so for me, I was like, dang, okay. And so then he was like, so my principal said, and I was like, what did your principal say? And so the principal said that there, you know, that he has the freedom of speech, that he's not forced to use the preferred pronouns or to use the preferred name. And then he was like, well, what do I do, Alyson? And so for me, I think it goes back to that. And one thing that he did say, he's like, it's always about respect. And for me, yes, it's 160% about respect and fostering those relationships and making the students feel safe, and also acknowledging that, hey, you may not agree with or understand what your student is going through, but that doesn't mean that you can't be respectful or supportive of, or just these different things and ways that you can show up for your students. And so I wanted to mention that because I think also us being here, at least we have some kind of interest or something like that, that we are supportive, or we want to be supportive of our youth. And this is just an example of someone that you may encounter that's like, no, thank you. And so, yeah, just different ways that we can go through that. Okay. This is just some of the different things that my students had said. You know, I feel, what does it feel like when they don't use your pronouns? What does it feel like when they don't, when you're not inclusive? And I think the one that kind of killed me the most was, I've been barked at, I've been laughed at, I've been called slurs. It's dehumanizing. And I think it is like these students that are kind of my motivation and my desire in wanting to, you know, do this work and to figure out different ways to make them feel safe and to make them feel at home. Okay, so I really appreciate you all weathering that with me. and I recognize that I went really almost up to the time, but I also want, if anyone has any questions or feedback or anything, really, I would just love the opportunity to address any of that too. Okay. Well, I'm cool with Friday afternoon, getting out a little early too. Oh, okay.
No, I would love to ask you a question real quick. You did so great, Alyson. That was phenomenal.
Oh,
And what a way to end our series. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask you, kind of, I know you had to hurry over that comment from another teacher, I think you said, that's not supportive of students. And, you know, kind of maybe your experience in chatting with students about other adults in the building that are not supportive of them, and how you maybe navigate some of those conversations with your students.
I love that. I'll definitely put what I kind of say to them, and I would love if anyone else has feedback, because now that I can actually see who's here, I'm like, oh yes, they have a lot of insight. And so for me, what I tell those students is, it sucks, again, to kind of like try and normalize that experience and being like, yes, I see you, I know what you're going through. And then also trying to carry it over to be like, hey, who are those people that are super supportive to you? Who are the people that you can go to when things are really hard? And also being like, trying to draw some parallel. And I, don't get me wrong, a student doesn't go, hey, I'm having a really hard day, this teacher's really mean to me. I'm like, okay, well, that's just life. I don't do that, but I will at sometimes incorporate some of those things if they're in the position to hear it, and just be like, hey, we're going to go through really hard things. This is really hard. And this is one of those ways that we can learn to formulate these groups around us and to create this supportive kind of network around us, because we are going to continue to go through different challenges. And so what are the ways that we can use this as an experience? And what are the ways that we can kind of get some of those different resilience factors and being able to kind of survive where we are right now and thrive? And if anyone else like opinions, please, that's just kind of like the dialogue, or what I tend to go with for my students is something along those lines. there. I skipped, and now as I like think about all the different things too that I wanted to talk about, there's like I missed some, but you know, I could talk forever about all of this. Anything else anyone can think of?
Awesome. Well, if there are no other questions, Alyson, we just want to thank you again so much for presenting. This was such a fantastic presentation, and thank all of you for attending and for supporting our work this year with this webinar series. It has been such a great experience for all of us to learn and expand our competencies as practitioners who regularly encounter this in our work. So thank you all so much, and thank you, Alyson and Seychelle, our interpreter. Have a great weekend, everybody.